Hello everybody and welcome to a new video. It's another comparison with Canon cameras, this time featuring the R6 and its successor the R6 Mark II. Let's get right into it. These two cameras are very similar. Same dimensions, same weather sealed body, roughly the same weight, and the button layout is almost identical, albeit with a few key changes. The R6 Mark II has a dedicated photo-video switch, and that means you can use the custom modes C1 to C3 for photos and video, and they can be configured separately for the two recording modes. On the R6, the same switch works to turn the camera on and off. To go to video mode, you have to use the main shooting dial, and that means the custom modes only work for still photography, not video. The autofocus joystick has a different design. Canon got rid of the four sharp edges and made the surface a bit convex on the new camera. To be honest, I find the R6 Mark I version easier to grab. For the rest, the two cameras have excellent ergonomics, a very comfortable grip, responsive buttons, and precise dials to turn. They have 7 custom buttons plus the function ring on the RF lenses. The menu system is the same and includes the My Menu section. On the R6 Mark II, you can also change the quick menu. The viewfinder is the same and is a good one, bright, clear, and you can select a fast frame rate. The magnification is decent, and I find both cameras easy enough to use when wearing glasses. The LCD monitor has a good resolution, your standard multi-angle mechanism, and the touchscreen allows you to do many things like navigating the menu and change settings. The two cameras use the same LPE6 battery, and I got similar results for still photography, whereas the R6 Mark II recorded for a longer time in 4K, as you can see. There are 2 card slots on the side for each camera in a dedicated compartment with the usual options concerning sorting the files and backup. The physical connections are also the same. We have a microphone input, headphone output, remote input, USB Type-C port that works at 10 gigabit per second, and a micro HDMI output. An interesting option on the R6 Mark II is that you can use the Canon Camera Connect app on your phone with a USB cable and not just rely on Wi-Fi. You can remote control the camera or transfer images to your smart device. The connection is instantaneous and should consume less battery in comparison to using Wi-Fi. One thing to be aware though, if you have an iPhone, the Lightning to USB cable that comes with your Apple device doesn't work. Canon recommends the Anker 514 Lightning to USB-C cable, which is the one you can see here, but this particular cable doesn't work for charging your phone. Both cameras use a full-frame sensor with a low-pass filter. The R6 has 20.1 megapixel, whereas the R6 Mark II has 24.2 megapixel. Note that the Mark II sensor is not the same as the flagship R3. It is not stacked and doesn't have a backside illuminated design. If we look at dynamic range, both cameras are capable of preserving a good amount of details in the shadows and highlights. If I push the test to the extreme, the original R6 displays a bit of extra noise in the dark areas. You can notice this on the blue coat and next to the paw of the stuffed toy. But to be fair, it's a small difference that will hardly affect your daily work. With a more difficult highlight recovery, the R6 Mark I saves a bit more information, but once again, the distinction is too small to be worth thinking about. The ISO range remains the same on both cameras, as you can see. No surprises, the amount of noise generated as you increase the ISO level is very similar. Noise on the R6 II images appears slightly more uniform and smooth by a very small amount. Finally, if we look at the built-in picture styles and skin tones, the R6 Mark II image is a bit cooler with more magenta in comparison to the original R6. That also applies to other profiles and is also valid for video. The two cameras share the same maximum speed when using the mechanical shutter. Choose the electronic shutter and the R6 goes up to 20 frames per second, whereas the R6 Mark II does 40 frames per second, meaning double the speed, which is quite impressive. The R6 Mark II also has a faster sensor readout. You can see that rolling shutter is more contained on the new camera, especially when doing quick movements. With buffer, the R6 Mark II can work at full speed for just over 2 seconds when shooting RAW at 40 frames per second. Choose JPEG and the duration increases to 6 seconds. With either file, the speed decreases significantly once the buffer is full. At 20 frames per second, the Mark II model manages 6 seconds with RAW and 17 seconds with JPEGs. This is the speed that allows us to compare it directly with its predecessor, and, as you can see, the older camera has a larger buffer, also aided by the smaller files. The most annoying thing on the R6 Mark II is that when the buffer is full, the camera stops shooting completely for 3 or even 5 seconds rather than continuing straight away at a slower speed. The R6 does the same, but the break is much shorter, around 1 second usually, so it's important to press the shutter button at the right time with the Mark II model. If you press it too soon, you can miss key moments of the action. You can improve the R6 II performance by selecting C-RAW, which means compact RAW. To give you a better idea, the camera increases the buffer from 2 seconds to 6 seconds at 40 frames per second, or from 6 seconds to 17 seconds at 20 frames per second, which is significant. Also, the pauses the camera makes once the buffer is full are shorter. One thing to know about Compact RAW is that if you push the parameters too much in post, the quality is worse in comparison to the normal RAW file. You can see in this example with a strong 4 stops recovery, there are less details on the stuffed toy with the C-RAW version and what looks like compression artifacts. You probably won't need to recover shadows that far, but it's an extra piece of information for you to know. The R6 Mark II features the RAW burst mode with a pre-shooting option. The camera will pre-record images for zero point 0.5 seconds at 30 frames per second, so around 15 frames, before you fully press the shutter button. This allows you to freeze instants that happened half a second before you started taking pictures, and it works with continuous autofocus and tracking. There are a few limitations with this function. The images are all saved into one large RAW file that popular software such as Lightroom or Photoshop won't recognize. Your only option is to export single RAW frames one by one, either in camera or with the Canon Digital Photo Professional software. What's interesting, however, is the buffer. The performance with the RAW burst mode is rather good, probably because it's easier for the camera to write one large file rather than several smaller files. My test gave me 340 RAW files in about 11 seconds, but then the camera stopped entirely. The two cameras feature Canon's dual-pixel CMOS AF2 in combination with deep learning algorithms and subject tracking, but Canon says that the R6 Mark II has a more advanced version of the software. For example, it has a greater understanding of the human body and it can track the head or torso better when the face is hidden. The new camera can also detect a larger variety of subjects, such as airplanes and trains. As for animals, it can track horses and zebras in addition to dogs, cats, and birds. There is also an auto setting so that you don't have to manually switch from one subject to the other. Another improvement is that you can activate subject tracking with any autofocus area on the Mark II model, whereas on the R6 you have to select the dedicated tracking area. Then we have the left eye or right eye priority on the new camera and as you can see, it works really well, even when the subject moves and doesn't face the camera directly. Note that when using the tracking area on the R6 Mark I or the whole area AF on the R6 Mark II, you can give priority to the left or right eye by simply moving the AF joystick. Let's move on to my face and eye detection test, first in good light conditions. Here you can see the results for the R6 with a very good hit rate of 85%, and that has been consistent since the first time I tested the camera 2 years ago. Then we have the R6 Mark II with a slightly better result, but keep in mind that a difference of 1% is too small to really matter. In short, the two products gave me the same performance. They struggled a bit when the person walked away from the camera and when she turned on herself the second time, but they kept the autofocus points on the head when the face was not visible rather than focusing somewhere else. The same test with 4K video shows the R6 is slightly slower when she walks at the beginning, but the camera is also a bit more reactive than the R6 Mark II when the person turned on herself. On paper, the two cameras have the same low light rating for the autofocus, but my second test tells a different story, where the R6 Mark II delivers the better performance. The new camera gave me a keeper rate of 85%, so basically the same as the previous test. The R6 Mark I dropped to 70%. Both cameras were equally capable of tracking the subject when she was in complete darkness, but there are more images taken with the original R6 that have inaccurate focus. In video mode, the R6 lost the subject for a few seconds when she was in the dark, whereas the R6 Mark II managed to track better all the way to the end. So the real advantage with the new camera seems to be in low light, not because it has a better sensitivity, but probably because the improved algorithm is more effective when the subject is less visible. I can also share an extra feedback with you. I had the chance to use the R6 Mark II for a music concert, and the performance was flawless, with musicians in different positions, moving a lot, and the lighting changing every 2 seconds. It had little problems finding the eye and focusing correctly right away. Next, we can talk about my birds in flight test. The R6 has been excellent since the beginning. I tested the camera multiple times with different firmwares and lenses, and it always delivered the same keeper rate. It's a great performer for fast action. The R6 Mark II gave me the same result, but with the added benefit of shooting at double the frame rate, which is no small feat. Both cameras do really well in detecting the subject and tracking right away, whether the bird is big or small in the frame. They are very quick to correct focus and they rarely miss focus on the background. Here we have the autofocus score for the R6 and R6 Mark II, as well as how they compare to other cameras. You can read more about my birds in flight test on my website and see how other cameras rank. The link is in the description. Finally, here are the settings that gave me the best results for birds in flight on these two cameras. If you're interested, let me know if they work for you as well. Let's begin with a list of all the main specifications you'll find on these two cameras. They record in 4K up to 60 frames per second, but the R6 Mark II does this without sensor crop, whereas the R6 Mark I applies a small crop. When it comes to sharpness, both cameras are equally capable of resolving an excellent amount of details when using a good lens. The quality remains the same whether you shoot at 24, 25, 30p or at 50, 60p. In Full HD, the R6 renders slightly better details than the Mark II model. With the high-speed mode in Full HD, the new camera can record at 180 frames per second, whereas its predecessor stops at 120 frames per second. Additionally, the R6 Mark II doesn't have the 7 minutes per clip limitation found on its predecessor when using the high-speed mode. Another addition on the new camera is the possibility of recording 6K ProRes RAW video via the HDMI port and the Atomos Ninja 5 or Ninja 5 Plus recorders. Unfortunately, the Atomos devices need an update that was not available at the time of recording this video. Another advantage with the R6 Mark II is that you don't have the 30 minutes per clip limitation when recording video, unlike the R6. And I can hear your question already. What about overheating? That has been a problem with the R6 since day one. Despite firmware updates that try to tackle the issue, I found the camera to be unreliable after 45 minutes of 4K 25p recording. The R6 shuts down, and you can only record a small amount before it needs to cool again. As you can imagine, it's worse with 4K 50p. Thankfully, the R6 Mark II comes with an improved design that manages heat more efficiently. I was able to record 2 hours and 15 minutes in 4K 25p and 1 hour and a half in 4K 50p. On both situations, the recording stopped because the battery died, not because the camera overheated. Both products feature HDR-PQ and the Canon Log 3. These work in 10-bit 422 and are available to record internally. Dynamic range is pretty much the same when both cameras are set on C-Log 3. The R6 also features the Canon log profile, which has a base ISO of 400 rather than 800. It produces a darker exposure, and if you try to match the same brightness as C-Log 3, you will lose data on the highlights. The normal ISO range is a bit smaller for video than for stills, as you can see. Here as well, there are no relevant differences worth to highlight. The R6 Mark II produces slightly more noise, but it's a small disparity with its predecessor. Finally, rolling shutter is more contained on the R6 Mark II with small and fast movements. In both cases, you can reduce distortion further by recording at 50 or 60 frames per second. The two cameras have the same technology, 5-axis stabilization on the sensor, with the same rating of 8 stops for compensation, although that will change depending on the lens. But here I found a small difference in performance when it comes to still photography. I captured 10 images at different shutter speeds to see how many of them were sharp, meaning visible details without motion blur. I used the RF 24-105mm f4, so there was stabilization on the sensor and optical stabilization on the lens working together. The original R6 managed to give me two decent results with a 4-second exposure handheld, which is really impressive, and delivered a slightly higher keeper rate all along. For video, the performance is more equal. When working with the camera, the result is far from perfect, but jerks and sudden shifts are not too invasive. There is some warp distortion when using a short focal length, 24mm or lower, which is especially visible in the corners. This is a known limitation of this technology. You can activate digital IS, which means electronic stabilization, to reduce the effect. The standard level does a decent job without cropping your image too much. The enhanced level is more stable, but also introduces more motion blur, and the result is less pleasant. Alright, we're reaching the end of this video, but there are two more things I want to mention briefly. First, the R6 Mark II has a number of extra features you won't find on the predecessor, and you can read them right now on the left. I'm not going to explain all of them, but I certainly appreciated the focus stacking option. It works really well if you select a small focus increment, and the camera saves all the frames in the SD card anyway if you prefer to stack them in post. Note that this mode uses the electronic shutter and is not compatible with flash. Then we have the high frequency anti flicker mode that allows you to sync the shutter speed to a higher degree of precision to avoid flickering and banding when using the electronic shutter or when recording video. There is an automatic detection mode that finds the correct frequency and set the optimal shutter speed for you. Another cool option is what Canon calls detection only for subject detection autofocus. Basically, in video mode, you can tell the camera not to focus on the background when your subject leaves the frame. The second and final point is about the retail prices for these two cameras, and as you can see, the R6 Mark II is more expensive. That's it. I hope this video was helpful for you. Thank you very much for watching. Please like and subscribe, and don't hesitate to leave a comment if you have any question. And I'll see you next time. Bye bye.